Welcome back to a live reading of The Effigy of Love, as written by Tony Sherblom and read by Juho Hankela. This is Chapter 10, Emerald Dreams. Only once Hendrik stood outside the door to his chambers did the tension in his body slowly release its tight grip. His heart and breath ran hot in his chest. His legs were aching, and his shaking hands struggled to find the key to his door. None of that mattered for the moment, though. He had made it back safe and sound against all odds. In fact, to Hendrik's luck, it seemed to matter little if he was stalking the halls during the darkest of night or brightest of day. The guards were always as careless and inattentive. And why wouldn't they be? They were forced to protect the halls they could never even dream of inhabiting. With Felth as their captain, they were treated as well as the bloodhounds in the kennel, which in turn had given them a vicious nature. A perfectly appropriate shade of color to wear in a grey world like this. Hendrik had tried keeping an eye on the guards for the last weeks, studying their patterns and routines in an effort to get the upper hand, yet he was still unsure of how many guards there even were in the castle, not to mention if they ever got rest. To him, all those men, clad in chainmail and sun-bleached blue tabards, sharpened short swords swinging by the hip, looked like one another, droning like bleary-eyed ants. Yet, what Hendrik feared the most, as of yesterday's abduction of his beloved painting, was not the sharp swords, but the wicked minds of the people around him. The servants might know their place, not to bar the nobles rushing down the corridors, or let their eyes linger on them for too long, but they were always present, and hardly stupid. It was clear someone was conspiring together with his mother, but who? Or how many? If his sneaking became routine, they'd start putting things together, and all the tidbits would grow into rumors, and rumors spread quickly as lice in these tormenting halls. Then everyone would harbor a secret, his secret, and nothing was as powerful a weapon as a secret. That's why they were kept hidden, deep inside and out of reach, never to be revealed, like Myrtle had taught him. Anything that can't be used for good should never be used at all. A paralyzing anxiety gripped Hendrik, shattering his train of thought like the heel of a boot on thin ice, as he heard footsteps approaching down the dim hall. He couldn't be caught now, standing outside his own chambers, an arrow in the neck from crossing the ford, or a torturous interrogation for being caught sneaking around would be fair, but being caught outside his chambers, dressed in yesterday's dirty garments, damp with sweat, and with no excuse at hand, seemed too cruel even for fate. Thus he held his breath to steady his trembling hands and swiftly eased the key into the locking mechanism. As he twisted the key, he covered the lock with his left hand in a desperate attempt to muffle the sound, but the clack that bounced off the stone walls in the corridor was like a thunderclap. Hendrik cringed, but as the echo died out, he noticed the footsteps had halted. The silence was thick as mud, making the sound of his beating heart sound like an oxen stomping around in his head. As he grabbed the door ring to keep it from clattering against the wood, and gave the door a hard shove. You see, he knew his door all too well, the monotonous wail of the hinges that tormented him his entire life, especially during humid days. But the trick to opening it silently was to push hard up to a certain point. Though it worked, him squeezing himself through the tight gap, closing the door and locking it again, he was afforded no reprieve. No more had he left out the long withheld breath before the footsteps had reached his door. Ice-cold waves of fear and anxiety crashed down over him, petrifying him and washing away all of his colors as keys jingled on the other side. Someone was entering his chambers, and they were going to find him right behind the door, pale as the moon, chest convulsing with exhaustion, looking like a rabble in noble's clothing. The clack hit Hendrik like an arrow in the gut, making him take a step backward. The hinges grew silent as soon as they had begun their lamenting, though, for the door came to a quick halt, having hit the tip of Hendrik's boot. A worn wimple and a wrinkly face peeked in through the gap, a sight as welcome as the morning sun over the horizon. "Young master?" Myrtle said, utterly perplexed at finding Hendrik standing on the other side. "Where are you off to?" "Oh, sweet God, thank you," Hendrik sighed, as his whole body was relieved of the tension. "Stay silent and get in. He grabbed the old maid's arm and pulled her inside before swiftly closing the door behind them. "Young master?" Myrtle whispered, her voice an equal mixture of empathy and chastisement, as her eyes ran over the boy, leaning against the door as if holding a mob at bay, and looking as if he had fought that same mob an hour earlier. "Did I not ask you to be more careful? If these tired old eyes can see clearly in a dim room that you've been up to no good, then not even God could save you from the trouble you'd be in if somebody else saw you right now. Where have you been, and what have you done?" Hendrik cast his gaze down to the flagstone floor between them. He didn't want to meet her eyes, fearing he would reveal too much by merely looking at her, that caring, warm angel always succeeding in prying everything out of him. Even now, when he was caught red-handed and feared for his life, he felt not a single hint of reproach or anger in her being, only an aura of calm acceptance emanating from her. As she walked up to him and put a hand on his arm, Myrtle's presence could tame even the wildest of winds and fiercest of beasts, and Hendrik was but a young man, lost, scared, and full of secrets. "Hendrik," she whispered, and slowly lifted his chin, the boy reluctant to look her in the eye. Her soft, warm touch, in addition to her calling him by his name, made him want to melt into a pool of tears. Only titles or vulgar labels were used in the castle. Thus hearing his name wrapped in such empathy was almost too much to bear at this moment of distress and confusion. "Hendrik, you do not need to fear, my boy. I am not here to punish you, nor rob you of your secrets. You needn't answer any questions you don't want to answer. All I ask of you is to be more careful. Nay, more than ask, I beg of you." Hendrik couldn't find the words, no means to reply. All he could do was listen and melt in front of his loving, caring maid as he finally looked her in her grey yet warm eyes. "I know you can be stubborn, even rash, at times," she continued, and put her hand over his heart. "But please, if not for your sake, then for mine." "For your sake?" Hendrik's voice was as thin as spring ice. All of his energy had been spent roaring with the stars and rushing back to his chambers, and the last remnants of adrenaline had now been washed away with his tears. What do you mean?" Myrtle stroked his cheek, wiping away the trail left by the tears, and said, "It is my duty to see to it that you are punctually aroused from your sleep and immaculately dressed. Is it not? Now, if anyone saw you right now—" She left the sentence hanging in the air like the executioner's axe. Hendrik's eyes grew wild and wide. "No, they wouldn't." He shook his head, making Myrtle withdraw her hand. His voice was plastered with horror at the thought of Myrtle getting hurt because of something he had done. "This isn't about you, and if I'd get caught—" "Hendrik, relax. I didn't mean to scare you, only to remind you of the reality of things." Myrtle interrupted Hendrik and grabbed his cold hands. Only once their eyes locked again did she continue with an uncharacteristic, almost parental harshness. "You have to be more careful and less arrogant if you're to survive, out there or in here, doing God knows what. I have all the faith in the world that you're not doing anything bad, but you know how things work at the castle. I can't sit by and watch you recklessly get into trouble, knowing what will befall you when the Lord or Lady finds out. With my life also on the line as your caretaker, I think you'd do well to rethink your course of action." Hendrik could almost feel Myrtle's heartbeat, though she stood at arm's length. The old woman was almost quivering with fear, but whether it was for her own safety or his, he was unsure, and little did it matter. Hendrik closed his eyes and nodded. She was right as usual. He had been too busy to consider what consequences his actions might have on others, and that guilt was starting to creep up on him. Even thinking about Myrtle being hurt because of him made his heart ache. Never in a million lifetimes would he want such a stain on his conscience, and never would he let it come to that. "Myrtle." Hendrik opened his eyes and looked at the maid, still squeezing his cold, dirty hands with her warm, wrinkly hands. "I'd sooner let them empty me of my noble blood than let them harm a single grey hair on your wise head. Please, young master." She squeezed his hands tight. "Don't speak of such horrors. I'm sorry, Myrtle, I didn't mean it like that. Hendrik gnawed at his lower lip. I know you didn't, Myrtle replied with a sullen smile. The woman had probably seen untold amounts of horror during her long lifespan, and Hendrik didn't mean to burden her with more. Joy, on the other hand, was far more rare, and Hendrik was overflowing with secret joy as of late. I promise I'll take your words to heart, and speaking of hearts, Hendrik's mind floated away on an emerald daydream that made his face light up. Myrtle knitted her bushy brow and raised an angry finger between them. You know better than to spill your secrets, Hendrik, or have you forgotten my lessons? A dark cloud passed in front of Hendrik's recently smiling face. It was a bittersweet truth, that old wisdom of hers echoing in his mind, a lesson learned a long time ago. Secrets hurt only yourself, whereas spreading them only leads to others getting hurt. If he was to reveal his secret to her, no matter how wonderful it was, he was sure to get her into trouble. I have not, Hendrik replied bluntly and looked down at his feet. The toll of the bell felt like a bucket full of wintry river water washing over them both as they realized they were running out of time. Change into those. Myrtle started ushering Hendrik toward the chair in his bedchamber. Quickly! While Hendrik changed into clean clothes, Myrtle opened the curtains and let the cloud-filtered daylight in. Only then did he notice the black stains of coal on his cuff and knuckles from having rescued her from the coal chamber, as well as the smears of green imprinted by the moss and grass on his buttocks and back. Worst of all were the boots, utterly ruined from last night's plunges into the river, leather scuffed by the sharp rocks and caked with flaking mud. He swallowed a curse as he noticed the crumbs of dried mud on the floor, like a path for ants. In his chamber, the crumbs were barely noticeable, but that was only because he had already traveled down a handful of corridors before reaching his chambers. If someone was to follow the trail, the mere thought made his blood freeze in his veins. This is not good, he thought as he scrubbed himself clean with soap and water. Looking at himself in the mirror, the reflection spotless, immaculate, the curses turned into a prayer, asking that whoever cleaned that mess up wasn't smart or brave enough to put one and one together. Perfect, Myrtle whispered as she stepped up next to Hendrik by the mirror. The comment made Hendrik smile, yet what truly made him this happy was the memory of her. If anything was perfect, it was her and the love they shared. If only you knew, he replied wistfully. How he would love to tell Myrtle about everything he was feeling, from the boundless joy to the haunting longing, her colors and their dreams. His whole world had changed, turned upside down as a byproduct of finding her, but most of all, how much he had changed as a result. Not only in his mind, no, he felt as if he was made out of tempered steel, as if he was able to weather the most violent storm, as if he was the richest man on earth, yet also the poorest. He possessed everything he could ever imagine and wanted, yet always longed for more, for her. The constant longing for her was a bittersweet reminder of what he had, yet still didn't have. It was a reminder that he held on to nonetheless, for in the end it was all he had. I'm sorry for my harsh words earlier, young master. Myrtle's sudden embrace swept away the longing as she put an arm around Hendrik's waist and pressed her head against his upper arm. All I ever wanted was for you to be happy and safe, and that you'd stay that way. Myrtle, Hendrik replied, the most beautiful smile spreading over his lips. I truly am. The sound of heavy boots approaching made Hendrik's blood freeze in his veins, and quickly as a fox he put on his mask of apathy. Myrtle took a step to the side and cast her gaze to the floor the moment Malwyn pushed the heavy door open. Good, he muttered, once the wailing hinges silenced, staring first at his son, then at the maid. Then he turned on his heel and exited the chambers as quickly as he had come, with his 2 silent guards in tow. Hendrik gave Myrtle one last smile with his eyes as she handed him his dark blue coat. It still smelled of fresh forest air. And her. Though it was barely daybreak, it felt like he had left the pond a lifetime ago. Every cell in his body yearned for more, for her, and the smell filling his lungs did nothing to sate the feeling. What made it worse was the uncertainty of not knowing when he would be able to slip away to the pond again. He had promised he would be back as soon as he could, but would it be soon enough for her? He didn't even dare to hope that the time would come soon, lest his castle of clouds would disperse into the wind, and the vibrant anticipation would transmute into grey sadness. Yet, for all these dark thoughts tormenting his mind, the emerald dreams they had shared filled him up with the secret joy that was his, and his alone.